if the Glenn Show were a magazine, Harold Pollack would be on the masthead as a contributing editor. Unfortunately, the Glenn Show is so far from being a magazine, it's not even funny. No monies are flowing in here, and etc. But anyway, we will keep on keeping on.
Great. Well, I must say, given some of your other guests, it's kind of humbling to be on that masthead. So look forward to the conversation.
Thanks. I take that as a compliment, Harold. Listen, so we are talking here today on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, a national holiday. I think everywhere, is it not? Do not all the states also, all 50 of the states and the District of Columbia also honor Dr. King on this day? Do you happen to know that? I remember there was a controversy some years ago about Arizona in particular. There was a boycott movement that people were trying to get going because Arizona state legislature and governor hadn't signed a bill that officially recognized. Do you happen to know about that?
I believe that's been that they conceded that, and I think that all the states are observing the holiday, and it's not a day to go and try to get your forms notarized at the bank anywhere in the United States.
Yeah, well. I'm sitting here trying to figure out what Martin Luther King Day is about as a national holiday now, 45 years plus after his death. What exactly are we honoring here? I mean, I'm worried that it is becoming the honoring of Dr. King on this day, a reflexive public, expression of not especially well-focused sentiment. We're supposed to be in favor of service. Okay, we're supposed to be in favor of social justice. Okay, Dr. King was a drum major for justice. He lived and died for a cause. We're supposed to be celebrating the resolution of the great American dilemma of racial segregation, of the final owning up to the implications of our creed by extending equal rights to blacks and so on. And I'm, if it needs saying, I'm for all of that. But it still feels a little soft and squishy to me, this national celebration. I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, I think there's some inherent contradictions to a holiday like this. In the first place, the purpose of the holiday is to bring us together in the pride that we all feel for this really remarkable person in so many different ways. But part of that ceremonial task requires us to look past the fact that he was a very divisive figure in his own time.
Exactly.
And
yeah,
it's also striking to me to remember. I remember one of my earliest memories of American politics was of his assassination, and I remember sitting by the old black and white little television in our, in Teaneck, New Jersey, with my parents, watching transfixed, and my parents were just in horror. They were both civil rights activists, and the combination of the tragedy of the event and then the violence that was unleashed at his death was so shattering. And I remember, I was 5 years old, and I remember, that's something younger Americans don't really experience in the same way of what it was like to watch sort of network news as the common information experience of people. I also remember, by the way, when Robert Kennedy was killed, who my parents had actually met, and that it's impossible to remember for people who weren't alive, I think, how awful 1968 was. So I should put that out. But Martin Luther King was younger than President George H.W. Bush, and and he was a very divisive figure not that long ago, and it's we have to put a lot into the box and close the box in the name of national unity in order to really have this day be a day where all Americans can sort of enjoy it and feel good at the barbecue, or I guess this is not really a barbecue holiday, but the indoor barbecue.
I wish that every American within earshot would Google Martin Luther King, Riverside Church, 1967. And if they do that, they'll find there one of the reasons why King was so divisive. It was the speech that he gave when he finally broke with Lyndon Johnson, went public, and denounced the Vietnam War. And he denounced it in very specific and concrete terms: anti-militarism, anti-imperial/colonialism, and anti-racism. Mm-hmm. And in that speech, he said things like, Ho Chi Minh is not my enemy. He said things like, Fidel Castro is not my enemy. And he said things like, Mao Zedong is not my enemy. Okay, now, part of that was coming from a Christian humanistic perspective and a kind of quasi-pacifism in which he was saying, look, love your neighbor, love your brother, and war is bad. But part of it, I think, had a very kind of, rejecting anti-communism and this kind of Manichaean view about conflict and international relations and things of that kind. And it is a sharp contrast to the way in which Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered. I wish that people would also on this day Google Poor People's Campaign, 1968, Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy. Okay? And when they do that, they'll find out that when King was killed, he was killed in Memphis. He had gone there to support some workers, sanitation workers who were on strike. But he was in the midst of planning Poor People's March on Washington to challenge fundamental tenets of American capitalism. I mean, we're talking about inequality today. Well, Martin Luther King was talking in very serious and mass mobilization terms about inequality in 1968. There was going to be a tent city erected on the Mall in Washington, D.C., of poor people coming from all over the country who were going to sit there and who were not going to move. And this is not, by the way, is 3-4 years after Lyndon Johnson had announced the war on poverty, but many people like King felt that not nearly enough was being done to, grasp the reins and, do something about that problem. So I've talked a long time, Harold, and I don't want to soliloquize. I just want to say this is why I have a sense of disquiet about the way that King Day has come to be marked in our society, because nobody talks about those things except for the Cornel West or the Tavis Smiley or whatever, or the Glenn Loury.
Yeah, it's funny.
What do you think?
Well, you've said a lot there. A couple of thoughts. One is, I think that history will remind people of how difficult the time was and how much King himself struggled to figure out the right path forward. Lyndon Johnson believed in the war on poverty, fought for the war on poverty, and achieved an awful lot, but also, tragically wrecked his presidency in Vietnam. And there's no history would have been so different if somehow he or whoever's responsible for that debacle had managed to get us out of that. It reminds us that King was a person of the left, and I think that has to be stated straight up. I do think it's important to also remember that King was only one man, and he was the public face of a much broader social movement that he certainly didn't originate or in every way control. And it's
yeah.
There were boycotts of segregated streetcars, in the early 1900s. There were a whole list of names of people. Of course, Bayard Rustin is now receiving a lot of recognition, but there are people like E.D. Nixon and a whole long list of civil rights pioneers who didn't always agree with King, who were right there as well, and we should certainly think of them on this holiday.
Well said, Brother Pollack.
Thank you. And it's funny, I'm not a huge fan of Cornel West or Tavis Smiley, but I do think that they are they're marking some very important issues that have to be noted, and in remembering the themes that you are raising. I think one of the things that is really striking to me when you started mentioning the Poor People's Campaign is how little traction King was getting on some of these issues, and how easier it was to attack the formal legal structures of segregation than it was to go after some of the deeper economic sources of inequality and just so many of the things that had to be addressed to achieve genuine economic and social and political equality, for African Americans and for others in America.
This is a very important point that you're making. I grew up in Chicago. I think it was 1967 that King brought his campaign to Chicago to oppose residential segregation by race and all of the social inequalities attendant thereto, quality housing, educational opportunity differences, and so forth that could be observed across Chicago neighborhoods. Richard Daley Sr. was mayor of Chicago, a tough SOB, okay? And he was determined that King was not going to come to his city and create a whole lot of havoc. I don't mean to tar Daley with some kind of anti-civil rights brush. That's not what I'm saying here. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm saying that the issues that King wanted to raise were issues that partly implicated the administration of the city in its kind of abetting and reinforcing of the social patterns that created segregation and created racial disparity of opportunity in the city of Chicago. Yeah. And I say all of that to say this. He completely failed in Chicago to do anything that made any kind of lasting dent on the situation. And he met with vicious opposition.
Yeah.
I mean, there were marches through white neighborhoods, ethnic neighborhoods in Chicago, in which he was called everything, bottles and rocks and stones were hurled, and I don't know, not a whole lot got accomplished. I mean, I'm happy to be corrected if I've overlooked something from that march. And I think that just underscores what you're saying, that, the march in Selma, Alabama, or, the Montgomery, Alabama, or whatever, was one thing. Jim Crow segregation was one thing. The tacit racism of, indirect racism of various patterns of social organization that reinforce racial inequality in the North were much more difficult to penetrate.
Absolutely. And one thing, the classic civil rights movement attacking segregation in the South could really draw on a very powerful national coalition where you had African Americans living outside the South who were helping, you had the United Auto Workers, you had a system whose injustice was so profound that really no one could look at it in the face. And there was a simplicity to that and a starkness to that that made it a very vulnerable target. In some ways, King was one of the first television politicians. He understood the impact of the confrontations, whether it was the Selma Bridge or other places, where he could bring to the surface the kind of violence and intimidation that was always there, but that wasn't put in tens of millions of people's living rooms, during prime time. And if you come up to the city of Chicago with a much messier set of politics, and you have black politicians who are allied with Daley in various ways, you're just in a much messier situation where it's just harder to find a handhold. And I do think,
indeed,
there was a cold calculus of power that King did, and that everyone has to do in the movement for social justice, that involves understanding, where are the levers of politics that we can actually pull to make a difference here. And it's a messy process because, King was distrusted by people to his left because he was a coalition politician, and he was also distrusted by many of his supporters when he moved too far to the left in their view. For example, in opposing the Johnson administration, I think many liberals thought, what are you doing here? You should be focusing on racism in the United States, and now you're condemning the war. And
missing a deep point. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Missing a deep point. You're a citizen of the most powerful nation on earth. Your claims to equal treatment actually speak to deep humanistic claims that are relevant outside the boundaries, the political boundaries of the nation of which you happen to be a part. Missing a deep point that the example of African Americans, unrequited seeking of equal citizenship, would echo through the decades in places like Eastern Europe, even in Tiananmen Square, as people, certainly at the southern tip of the African continent, seek their own freedom and equality and look to the example that King played a prominent part in creating as a model for how their claims might be pressed. So, yeah, he was off the reservation, but then the reservation they were trying to keep him on was much, much too small for the kind of moral truth that his political activity spoke to.
Well, that's very well said, but it also points to the internal conflict among many people who were receptive to what King said, but who weren't willing to go as far as he was willing to go, or you just went. Many people thought, basically we have an American creed which we are so violating, which we take such pride in, and we're so violating in our treatment of racial minorities. But and we're willing to work to change that, but we're more suspicious of the more fundamental critique. Well, actually, the American creed and the role of America in the world itself has some problematic elements that the King also wanted to bring to the table, and there were many people who were much less comfortable with that. And you can be a Cold War liberal who is completely supportive of civil rights, but also say, well, actually, Mao and Fidel are my enemies, and and then that doesn't make you an evil person, but it puts you in a different place from Martin King in 1967.
I hear you. Scoop Jackson certainly supported everything King wanted to do on the domestic front, but probably had a radically different view of what implications, if any, that might have for America's role in the world.
Can I raise one other aspect of King which strikes me? Last Friday, I was on a panel in which at the University of Chicago, where we showed a film called How to Survive a Plague, which is a wonderful history of ACT UP. Who of course are HIV activists, most of whom were people living with HIV and AIDS, and many of whom did not survive to today. And it was a very and there's a lot of footage of very angry ACT UP, and often very funny ACT UP political theater. My favorite being that they placed the giant condom over the house of Jesse Helms, and they had a little sign that said "Unsafe Politics."
Oh, come on, yes. Really? Over his actual residence?
His actual residence, that gigantic canvas, and I look at that and I'm thinking, this is I got nothing to criticize about that, and they didn't damage anything. They just and of course the bemused people in this neighborhood in North Carolina watching this, you can imagine their reaction. But one of the things that struck me was how much the young people in the audience for the film really wanted to find a cause today where they could kind of go in the streets and scream at. There's one scene where the people are screaming at Cardinal O'Connor in a church in New York, and Cardinal O'Connor had horrible views on HIV and AIDS, and the Catholic Church opposed important public health messages about condoms, and in other ways was not on the right side of the HIV issue then, and certainly there's a long way to go today. But there was an envy among many of the people watching the film that you could just kind of get out there and scream at people in a way that was very antithetical to what made King so successful. King was willing to do an angry demonstration, but he was also, part of the power of his message was its civility and its ability to cross boundaries. And
I see. So if it's political theater, this audience you're talking about get the theater part, but they don't get the politics part.
Yeah, and they were, and one of the things that I was saying in the talk afterwards was, it was great to put a condom over Jesse Helms' house, but what are you going to do about Charles Rangel, who was also against a lot of the same things? That would not have been, if you went and held this vigil like that in front of his house, you wouldn't have convinced anybody. And in fact, a lot of if you went to a church down here in Chicago in Little Village, and showed up and disrupted it, and to try to get people to think in a different way about gay rights, you would have precisely the opposite impact. And so there's different. You need different tools in the toolkit, and a lot of young progressives, I think, need to think a little harder about how to how to reach people that we're not reaching right now.
Yeah. I just want to say one thing before I forgot it. I wonder if you know the novel by Charles Johnson called Dreamer. You know Charles Johnson, author of Middle Passage. He's, I believe he's still at the University of Washington in Seattle, where he teaches writing. And I mean, he's a great American novelist. Middle Passage won the National Book Award in some year. And Dreamer is a fictional imagining of King having had a double. You know, for his safety, there was someone that they found who looked very much like him. And they would, you know, use the double to, I don't know, anticipate and confuse people who might want to do him harm. And Martin Luther King Jr. himself, in this novel, this fictional imagining, actually survives April of 1968, and but has to somehow reconstruct his life underground. I'm not remembering all the details of the plot. But
this sounds so fascinating. I did not know the book. And
it's a deep reflection. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting piece of writing. I just wanted to mention it.
I can't help thinking that Martin Luther King would be so disappointed by so much of what he's seen, of what's transpired. And I think one reason that people were so enraged at his assassination, other than, of course, their righteous anger at the atrocity that occurred, was there really was a kind of death of hope that exemplified, and that whole year exemplified. And
I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, hero.
No, go ahead. I
was just going to observe that he was 39 years old. And RFK was how old? 43, 45? Whatever.
Yeah.
I'm
young
talking.
Guys.
Martin Luther King Jr. was a quarter of a century younger than I am sitting here talking to you right now when he was taken out. God only knows what he might have done with all of the political and moral capital that he was accumulating. I suppose the National Review and Weekly Standard types would say he was a soft socialist lefty, and he would have gotten chewed up in the political coming to our senses that the post-1960s evolution of American politics represented. You know, that he would have come to nothing, that he would have been a glorified or a higher profile or more effective Jesse Jackson. But I don't think so. I mean, I think that, it's easy for us to sit here and speculate. I think that he would have had a much more substantive and, important impact on American politics if he had survived.
I would say the tribute to him is that he would not have had a holiday, that he would have done some things.
Exactly. Good point.
that would have really been difficult. And I think what he would have been caught up in, I think, was that the real heirs of Martin Luther King were elected black politicians who then had to actually deal with the messiness that he could, as an outsider, address in a different way. If you're David Dinkins, in some ways you really are the heir of Martin Luther King, or some of the southern mayors in Atlanta, places like that. And suddenly you have to run the place, but what you're running is a city that's predominantly minority, whose economic structures are being punished by changes in the global economy, and you are suddenly responsible for things like public safety and all the rest. And it would be a difficult. He would have faced some pretty difficult challenges just because the next turn of the wheel was just more complicated.
Indeed. In fact, I think that is one of the criticisms of Jesse Jackson's career. Jesse Jackson Sr., that I believe is justified. Some of them I think are cheap shots, but the idea that Jackson never got down to cases, he wouldn't run for mayor of Chicago or mayor of Washington, D.C., that he actually would have had some chance of succeeding at, but would have left him with a budget to balance, a legislature to deal with, a whole lot of complicated and ambiguous issues in education and public safety and so forth to confront, and would have meant translating the rhetoric of outrage and claiming for high moral principle into practical coalition-based, program and initiative that would have effectively addressed the problems of his people. And Jackson never took that step. And I believe that represented a missed opportunity or a challenge not faced up to by him. Just my opinion.
wonder what, by the way, another person who I really wonder about is Harold Washington in that regard, who was a wonderful person who was cut short as mayor of Chicago. What would he have been able to do with our public education system or our public health system if he really had the time to not just be the city's first black mayor, but to really run the place for an extended period.
Should be noted that he was cut short by natural causes, not because somebody shot him down.
Yes. I think, whenever I see, if you go to Manny's, that wonderful old-style Jewish cafeteria deli over on Jefferson and Roosevelt, they've got pictures of Harold Washington and the rest there, and maybe we should hope they have fewer pictures there of in terms of their cardiovascular impact on these guys. But you've ever been over to Manny's? It's quite a place.
I have not. I've been in a Jewish deli before, and I know getting out of there alive is a challenge.
Yeah, it comes with a free gift certificate at Springfield Hospital there. So that's, but in a sense, the fact that King gets a holiday is a sign that he was not he was not enmeshed in the kinds of things that would be dangerous politically today, or at least that people have conveniently forgotten. In some sense, Vietnam gets to be bracketed, but you can imagine. I certainly think he would have been a major advocate for things like the Humphrey Hawkins bill in Congress. The way that we have over the past 5 years allowed our concern over the long-term deficit to trump our concern over the immediate suffering of the unemployed is precisely the kind of issue that we need voices like Martin King's to say, no, that's really not acceptable in a wealthy society that is facing an economic challenge. I don't know how he would have responded to the HIV epidemic, but certainly in its early days, the profound failure of our political leadership, and certainly including the political leadership of the African American community to deal with this issue with the urgency that it deserves, meant that many thousands of people died who could have been saved. So there's certainly he had work to do.
This is a fun parlor game to play. What would King have done about this or that? I mean, I think the anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s would have looked maybe not much different, but higher volume and bigger footprint if he had survived. And I think this challenge, the black church is theologically conservative. Homosexuality is a sin, et cetera, et cetera. And yet the HIV epidemic, which hits on blacks very heavily. The challenge of whether or not a kind of theological revision and, sort of challenging. We're challenged now. Of course, we have our doctrine and we have our practice and we have our tradition, but these are different times, and the justice and the sort of humanitarian implications. So our cultural heritage is challenged by these new facts on the ground. One would like to think that a Martin Luther King Jr. could have seen the necessity of revision and a broadening of the view, but I don't know that we can be certain of that. I mean, I can imagine also, given the tradition that he came out of, Ebenezer Baptist Church, you know what I'm saying? His father was a Baptist preacher. Everybody within earshot of him was a Baptist preacher. I don't know. I think it's a tough call.
It is, well, especially given the high degree of sexism within the civil rights leadership itself. It's hard to say how they would have responded to that more profound challenge. If we think about the failures of Dr. King and others, certainly, the way that women were marginalized, and the way that certainly the way that someone who was gay in that moment was going to be marginalized. That is part of their record as well.
Man, you're going into dangerous territory here. I grew up in Chicago in the 1950s and 60s. I can remember some of my aunts were very prominent leaders in the African Methodist Episcopal Church that I attended, the Bethel AME Church on the south side of Chicago, 45th and Michigan Avenue. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot from having sat around and hearing them over the kitchen table and such as a kid coming up about the like wholesale hypocrisy on sexual matters within some corners of the black, sort of Pentecostal, evangelical, clerical ranks. I mean, okay, so the church is going to elect bishops. So electing bishops means you go to the convention and you get delegates to vote for your guy. So a big church in Detroit, a big church in Chicago, a big church in Philadelphia, they all want their senior pastor to be made bishop of the church. So who's going to get chosen? So how do you influence the delegates? Okay, now I know for a fact that the hotel rooms around some of those conventions were filled with boys and girls.
Wow.
Boys and girls trading booty. Okay, can I say that on bloggingheads.tv?
Hey, it's your magazine. Yeah.
I mean, I know this for a fact, okay, because my auntie would come back from the convention and she would tell the stories about what was going on there, man. Okay, wow. So not only was King, a philanderer, we all know that he loved women. He wasn't faithful to his wife. I mean, he was in a wholesale manner, not faithful to his wife and so forth. But some of these guys had boys brought up to the room.
Yeah, the hypocrisy.
I'm just saying.
Yeah. No, well, one of the reasons why I must say, I was uncomfortable watching some of the scenes in this movie that I was telling you about, where the ACT UP protesters were in the church, shouting and doing a sit-in and so on. The anger that so many people in the gay community feel over the hypocrisy of highly conservative, deeply closeted religious leaders, is a real thing, and it's doesn't always lead people to behave in a way that I would behave, but it's a real, it's a real thing, and it is, and it certainly crosses every religious boundary, and not just religious institutions, but many others. I must say, one of the ironies in the film left unexplored is, on some issues of HIV. So you have Ed Koch, who's the most, I assume, I actually don't know that much about Ed Koch, but it's always been assumed he was the most prominent closeted person in American history, as far as I can tell, or one of the...
I did not know that Ed Koch was gay. I mean, I didn't know until this moment Ed Koch, former mayor of New York City, was gay. I did not know that.
I don't know that I know that, but he is described as, by 50 million people, as being, and he was, of course, a single man who had never, and he was viscerally despised because, by many people within the gay community and the HIV community. He did open Needle Exchange, which David Dinkins closed. So, it's a more complicated history in there. And, there's all sorts of... One of the challenges in the HIV world within the African-American community is not just the religious element, but just that socially conservative middle-class people are the political backbone of everything that's going to get done. And mostly for the good, but not always for the good. And, right now, if you went to neighborhoods of Chicago and you said, I want to understand, what people think, and I want to mobilize any sort of political effort to do something, who's going to actually do stuff? It's homeowners, it's people who are a little older, it's people who are organized and have it together to be major parts of the political process. And in 1992, who was not going to be there? And it is so anyway, those are the kinds of thoughts that were coming into my head. That's probably a tangent in terms of our broader agenda for the call, but
well, let's. We got in. We're 30 so many minutes in, and I'm wondering if we can maybe sort of wind our conversation down by turning to more contemporary issues that are also in the same general area. I mean, I saw an editorial in the New York Times the other day about voting rights. Of course, the Supreme Court's decision that struck down some provisions of Section 5 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act as no longer being appropriate because they identified jurisdictions that were subject to the pre-clearance provisions of that statute. That is, you want to change your voting laws, you have to get the approval of a federal court or the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. And that would apply to some, but not all, jurisdictions that supervise elections. And the Supreme Court held recently that that was anachronistic because it was based upon historical identification of jurisdictions as having been, presumptively suspect about racial fairness that may not any longer be relevant today. And, we've heard a lot about voter ID laws being racially biased and a sense of the clock being turned back by courts and by state legislatures that are trying to impose voter ID laws that have a racially disparate impact in terms of disqualifying voters and so on. So I'm wondering how, on this Martin Luther King Day, we are thinking about those issues. Do they rise to the same level of significance as getting, black people registered in Mississippi or Alabama to participate in local elections? And does the legacy of King speak to the controversies about that or about affirmative action that are racial in character and that are still a part of our present-day politics?
Well, a few things on the voter ID thing. I mean, it is certainly true. A couple things. One is that the Supreme Court is providing the best scholarly brief for theories of legal realism that I think you could ever find in a comparable period in America. It's sort of striking how Citizens United and the voter ID decisions and the healthcare reform decisions and so many others are so intimately involved in the landscape of American politics and partisan conflict, and how much you can predict who's going to vote what based on who appointed them, and it's a fairly depressing picture. There is a scholarly literature that suggests that it's certainly the case that when in states that the best predictors of who's going to pass voter ID laws are really variables that speak to the strategic value of these laws for the Republican Party in a state and the ability of Republicans to dominate the legislature to get those things through. The voter ID laws tend to come clustered with laws that outlaw Sunday voting and that limit hours and do other things that are obviously intended to constrain the African American community's voter turnout. Whether they can be justified in their specifics is another question, but we have pretty good reason to understand why these laws are being passed by whom. There's very little attention paid to voter fraud and absentee ballots, which is actually probably a more significant issue numerically than in-person voter fraud, which is really, as far as anyone can tell, is kind of a non-issue numerically. So it is.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I hear you on that, and I think what you say is absolutely right. No doubt, as you look around, that it is Republican governors and state legislatures more likely to do this, and no doubt that some of the motivation for doing so is to gain electoral advantage by limiting the effective voting of constituencies that you anticipate won't support you. The question I want to ask is, it's not obvious to me what's wrong with that. Now, I know how that's going to sound, but I just want to say this. I mean, politics ain't beanbag, and it's always been the case that the parameters surrounding the processes that govern election have been, contended for one way or another, contended over one way or another by interested parties who are trying to press their own political advantage. That's always been the case. I'm sure we can find examples of gerrymandering in which Democratic legislatures are drawing district lines in order to advantage Democratic candidates and constituencies at the expense of the effective representation of, groups that are likely not to go along with the Democratic program.
Surely we wouldn't have any examples like that in Illinois, though. So.
Oh, no. I mean, not in Illinois, but in other states. That kind of thing happens. So is the fact that race is a part of the demographic definition of a constituency to be relatively disadvantaged by a change in the voting law something that raises the generic practice of rigging the game to my own advantage to the level of being morally unacceptable and, a piece with old Jim Crow segregation? And if so, how is that justified? Because it's not at all clear to me that a racial constituency in 2014 is any more morally salient than an age constituency, a gender constituency, a farm versus urban constituency, or whatever.
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on there, and certainly I wouldn't compare anything to the Jim Crow laws. I mean, the Jim Crow laws were what they were, but I think there is something remarkably contemptible about efforts to hinder people from casting a lawful vote, and that I'm sure that Republicans aren't the only people to do that. But given the resonance of these issues, and given the momentary, I mean, I think what's happening is because Republicans win this sweeping victory in 2010, and they look at rising turnout among the Obama constituencies in 2008, and they think, how are we going to stop this? And there is something that's just profoundly contemptible about saying, we see this long-term trend that is politically unfavorable because we are actually a smaller group in America, so we have to somehow now look to the rules to suppress turnout. Certainly there are other, I'm sure that you could find democratic examples of that. But however you compare it, it is in fact quite contemptible. And it does illustrate the larger problem that we have to figure out how to run our elections in a less disgraceful way. Why they're on Tuesday, why we allow partisan control over the mechanics of this. We saw with Bush v. Gore the absurdity of that situation, and we just haven't been able to run a 21st century political process.
I should mention, I like what you're saying here, Harold. I think you're getting to the heart of the matter. There's a difference between configuring a district line so that the people on one side or the other consist of relatively more of my supporters.
Yeah.
Between doing that on the one hand and keeping somebody who's going to cast their ballot however they're going to cast it from having the opportunity to cast their ballot.
Yeah,
I take that point.
And I think even doing things that are, when we say we know African American churches want to go vote on Sunday, so we're going to stop that. That is, which is not quite the same. It's a nominally neutral, but obviously, but we all understand what's happening there. And it's...
Oh, I see. They come out from the pew after the Sunday morning service and fired up by whatever the sermon might have been. They head for the voting booth in larger numbers, and they pull the lever in a particular way.
Yeah, I missed what you said, but I think you got what was going on. I agree with you that gerrymandering is a different issue, and I do think gerrymandering is a problem because it undermines the legitimacy of the process, and I do think there's some questions about the drawing of majority-minority districts that need to be rethought. But I'm particularly focused on efforts to hindering people from casting votes as being in its own separate category.
I should just mention that I interviewed Wil Haygood, is his name, and he is at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. I think they just call it LDF now, and tries a lot of these cases on voting rights stuff. And he had a ton of concrete examples, municipal election in this town in Texas or this town in Arkansas or Alabama, where, people were trying to very blatantly, in effect, disenfranchise the minority constituents, the black constituencies in these particular places, and were given greater leeway to do so by, Supreme Court rulings and things like this that he was fighting. I wish I could remember all the details now, but he's on the record in a past Glenn Show episode. People should know about that.
Ari Berman's coverage of this has been quite excellent in The Nation, going through the mechanics of what's going on. And I do think, just to draw back to an earlier part of our conversation, some of this is our own fault, our being, putting myself as a progressive, that we are bored by the levers of conventional political power. And so in 2010, progressives stayed home, and we're pretty bored by a lot of the state and local elections that really matter a lot when you're talking about election law and drawing of congressional districts and all the rest. And so Republicans won these massive victories that were abetted by the fact that they just wanted it more in an off-year election. I often think of the comparison between Occupy and the Tea Party, where I look at many of the views held by the Tea Party folk are anathema to me, but they are remarkably effective and motivated in participating in congressional hearings and in primaries. And when I talk to a lot of the Occupy people, they say things like, well, the whole process is so ridiculous, I'm not even sure I'm going to vote. And they are alienated from the very levers that we need to really fight for. And so when it comes time to see who's going to get to draw those new boundaries, or in the case of Massachusetts, when Martha Coakley is a poor candidate and she's running against Scott Brown, and health reform is in the balance, how many people just didn't bother to vote, or they thought she as a candidate wasn't very appealing, so they sort of checked out of it. And and I think that we have to really rethink that on the left and make sure that we pay attention, even if it's not Barack Obama or Elizabeth Warren or somebody that's really exciting to us in our own terms, to make sure that we are there doing it.
I got to tell you this: Elizabeth Warren has now twice in the last 6 or 8 months come to Sunday morning services at the church that I attend here in Boston. Mm-hmm. On one occasion, she came with her husband and with 4 or 5 staff members. They were announced at the beginning of the service to have several other appointments that morning and unlikely to be able to stay, so apologies were offered in advance. Mm-hmm. And then the Reverend Dr. Ray Hammond Jr. began preaching. And they sat in that pew well past when everyone thought that they would have already gone on to their next thing, just, taking in what he had to say. And the remarks that Elizabeth Warren made with a Bible in her hand, standing up there in the pulpit before the sermon, she evinced, I thought, a real serious and authentic spirituality that I had no idea that a Harvard law professor who got herself elected to the United States Senate could possibly embrace. I was deeply impressed, not just because she, was in church, but because of the humanity and the kind of spiritual seriousness that this politician and U.S. senator and law professor and expert on financial regulation has shown in an African-American church in a little small community over there in Boston.
Yeah.
Just a fact about Elizabeth Warren that I don't think is widely appreciated.
Well, by the way, if Reverend Hammond were speaking and I were sitting there, I wouldn't go to my next appointment either.
Well, yeah, the brother's got something to say.
He's got some game there. I must say, by the way, if a short obnoxious Jewish professor at the University of Chicago said some of the things that Elizabeth Warren says, I'm not sure that he'd get the same traction. I think she has a wonderful sort of cultural location that allows her to. She brings a kind of Midwestern populism fused with left-wing politics in a very interesting way. In terms of her branding.
Okay. Yeah, she's definitely a thoroughbred, and politically speaking, and we're going to see what happens. But it's exciting.
But we have to be.
Listen here.
This is probably time to wrap it up. But I'll just say my own final thing is that is activism involves doing stuff that's boring and not just doing stuff that you can make a Will.i.am video out of. And some of the problems we've had with voting since 2010 and voter ID laws and the difficulties we've had in implementing health reform because of Republican resistance, some of those troubles arose because we didn't really, on our side, we didn't want it as much as people did on the Republican side, and now we're paying for it.
Yeah. All right. Well, let that be the last word for now, Harold. Thanks for talking with me, and hope to do it again.
Always
soon.
great talking to you.
Take care now.
Bye-bye.